Sweeney had 'em. My mother died with 'em. Woke up.
Hello, my name is Lori Strother, and I'm your host for Music Matters. Central Virginia has deep roots in music history, from traditional folk to blues, from bluegrass to rockabilly and country. Singers and musicians from right here in Central Virginia have made their mark in the world of music, and each one has in some way influenced the music we listen to today. Some you may have never heard of, while others became a part of the popular musical landscape. Come with us on this musical journey as we explore Music Matters, the roots of rhythm in Lynchburg. Although he was a musician before recording or photography devices were ever invented, Blind Billy was so popular in the Lynchburg and Central Virginia areas in the early 1800s, his obituary appeared in a Richmond newspaper citing, "All who ever heard him hung with delight on the sweet melody of his fife."
A lot of people don't know about Blind Billy. They don't know his story, and a lot of people definitely don't know that Blind Billy was from Lynchburg. Blind Billy was born in the early 1800s. His exact date of birth isn't known because he was born a slave. They didn't keep exact records on birth dates or deaths.
He was a fifer, so he played the fife. This was an instrument like a flute that would be played in military bands. African Americans frequently played as military musicians all the way from the American Revolution up through the 1850s when Blind Billy died.
The fife was a very popular instrument in this country, 18th century and 19th century. It was often paired with a drum, so you heard of a fife and drum corps.
That fife and drum tradition, today the only place you really see it anymore is the hill country of Mississippi with Othar Turner and others who are very well known. But this at one time was a tradition that was pretty much everywhere in the American South.
Blind Billy played all sorts of old-fashioned songs. He was known for his old Scotch airs. Those are songs basically that came from Scotland that were popular to be played on a fife. He played those not only in military settings, but also for parties and for other gatherings, balls, get-togethers in Lynchburg society. He was a popular musician who was in demand by pretty much everybody in town at a time when there was no way to have music on demand by recording. You had to ask somebody like Blind Billy to play for you. We don't know when Blind Billy lost his sight. He may have been born blind, or it may have happened at some point in his adult life.
In many cultures in the world, a tradition that blind people simply were hard to employ in other ways. And so they often would become musicians, often would play on the street. You see this in Europe, in Japan, all over the world.
My guess is that he learned to play just by hearing, by listening to other people play the fife and by spending many hours practicing his instrument. A lot of people commented on the fact that he just was so talented that he could hear a piece of music once and then be able to play it at any point on demand after that.
There are stories and reports that Blind Billy was able to recognize people as they approached him just by the sound. The way they approached him while they were walking or their voice.
Whenever he was playing on a downtown street corner, if somebody came up to him and asked him where was so-and-so's house or where was this location in town, he knew exactly where to go, what direction, and how to get you there.
One of the things that strikes me about Blind Billy is he has an obituary that appears in the Lynchburg newspaper when he dies in the 1850s, but it's copied in the Richmond newspaper, which makes you understand that people in Richmond knew him, which means he had a statewide presence or notoriety.
Few men are more distinguished in their pursuits than the deceased was in his. Bookshaw has been styled the father of the harp, so Billy may be called the master of the fife. It is doubtful whether a better performer on that instrument ever lived than he was. His reputation had extended far and wide, and Blind Billy was a name known throughout the state. Many are the military parades, the balls, and the parties that have been enlivened by his inspiring notes, and all who ever heard him have hung with delight on the sweet melody of his fife.
We are in one of the oldest sections of the cemetery. This is what we call the second acre of Old City Cemetery. That's the second acre of land donated by the town founder John Lynch to be used by the city as a public burial ground. In this particular section, there have been burials going back to the 18-teens and 1820s, all the way up through the 20th century. There are a lot of slaves who lived and died before the Civil War that are buried in this section. And that's why Blind Billy is in this particular area, because he himself was a slave, and when he died in 1855, this is the area where all of Lynchburg's slaves are buried. Blind Billy's tombstone is very special and unique among all the stones here in our cemetery because of how personalized it's been carved for him and his life. The tombstone carver has got a fife on the top here that's broken into two pieces that's snapped in half to symbolically show that his life is over, his music has ended, he'll no longer play his instrument. And it's really special that they took that time and effort for a slave to put that on his tombstone and to show symbolically what he did in life and also the fact that he has died and passed on. So it's extra special that that's been carved here, along with the inscription that mentions his name, the fact that it was erected by his wife, his age, and when he died. The date on the tombstone is actually in error. It's carved 1856, but he actually died in 1855. That's just an error that the tombstone carver made with that one digit. The 6 should be a 5.
Blind Billy, in addition to overcoming a disability, being one of the best fifers throughout Virginia, he was so popular and so good at what he did that he actually earned his freedom.
He was raised and owned by the late Dr. Hal Davis, but obtained his freedom a few years ago by means of a subscription raised for that purpose by the citizens of Lynchburg.
So that was just amazing, that to me, that a group of citizens actually pulled together their resources and bought his freedom. So that's the amazing thing about the Blind Billy story. Although he spent his life as a slave, he died a free man. That's why this story is very important. Not just to tell the story, but to remember him. And so that Lynchburg knows of this amazing man and his great craft, and that his story can live on for generations to come.
Joel Sweeney never knew Blind Billy, but he did learn how to play the banjo from other slaves in the area. Performed in traditional folk songs by Pete Seeger or Bella Fleck, or in bluegrass songs by Ralph Stanley, Bill Monroe, or Flatt and Scruggs. The banjo was wildly popularized in the U.S. beginning in the 1800s by none other than Joel Sweeney, who hailed from Appomattox.
Joel Sweeney was a fellow that was born here. It was Buckingham County at the time. He was born to the Sweeney family that lived here along the banks of the Appomattox River sometime between 1810 and 1816. They were a farming family. His father was a wheelwright in addition to being a farm laborer. So he had a shop and would have seen a lot of the folks travel along the Richmond-Lynchburg stage road here who needed work done to their carriages or their wagons. He would have been exposed to all of these travelers coming by on their way to or from Lynchburg and Richmond and all points in between. Joel was said to be really musically inclined at a very early age. And the rest of his family was as well, his brothers, his sisters, his cousins. It was said that he could mimic any sound that was made in nature, bird songs, animal calls. At a very early age, he also started going out to where African Americans lived, and we're not sure exactly who he learned from, but just up the road from where the Sweeneys lived was a large plantation. That's probably where Joel went. As I went up to Lynchburg town, I broke my yoke on the coaling ground. I went from there were dozens of enslaved Africans there. Old Johnny Booker do. When Africans were brought over from Africa, they certainly didn't leave their culture behind, but they brought it with them. He picked up on that. Says, Mr. Wright, do you have a yoke? He seized up his bellows and blew up a smoke. Old Johnny Booker. Johnny Booker, or the broken yoke in the coaling ground. It's basically a local geography lesson. It talks about a wagoner who's trying to pull his load of tobacco down to Lynchburg. He starts out from here in Appomattox and on the way travels through the area of Mount Athos and is trying to get across the river to Wright's shop on the Amherst side. By the time he was in his 20s, he was known around here, began playing in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. On court days, he would play. There are a number of accounts of him playing for special functions for Independence Day and when the militia was called out for march. He definitely did perform in Lynchburg, being really the closest metropolitan area that he could have quick and easy access to. Then he began playing further out in Lynchburg and Richmond, and by the time he was in his early 20s, by 1836, he was documented as playing in North Carolina, the Winston-Salem area. People were mad for this banjo music. It just so happened to correspond with the craze of the minstrel show. And so Joel Sweeney became a minstrel musician. The minstrel show was the popular entertainment of the 1800s for some folks. They were typically caricatures of African Americans. You know, there are a lot of ugly stereotypes of African Americans that came out of the minstrel show. Joel Sweeney was one of them. He would wear blackface, as was common in the minstrel shows, and do caricatures of African Americans. There's no getting around that. You know, you can't gloss that over. That's just part of the story, that time period. He performed all throughout the southern United States. By the mid-1840s, when he was in his 30s, he was performing in New York City on the stages there, and in the mid-1840s ended up going to play all the public theaters throughout England and Scotland and Ireland. In a time period where if you lived here along the banks of the Appomattox River, it was a big deal if you ever made your way all the way to Lynchburg. I'm going down to town, I'm going down to town, I'm going down to Lynchburg town to lay my back down. Apparently he had become so popular that there were folks that were passing themselves off as Joel Sweeney and Company, imposters. Down to town, going down to town. And it was bad enough, he thought that he had to put an ad out in the paper telling people that he was being impersonated and they were being defrauded by these people claiming to be him, who couldn't play a banjo nearly as well as he could. I'm going down to Lynchburg town to lay my back down. If you went to go see Joel Sweeney perform, not only was it probably the first time you'd ever seen a white man perform the banjo, it was probably the first time you'd ever seen a banjo. It was a novel and new thing, so much so that while he was touring throughout Europe, apparently one of the member of the troupe was stealing away when they weren't performing and snatching up Joel's banjo and copying it and making copies and selling them. So it got to the point where he actually hired a guard. And as soon as Joel Sweeney came off stage, he would pass his banjo over to this fellow that was guarding his banjo. He'd lock it up in a case. And he told the company that, you know, if anybody else were to try to make money off of the design of his banjo, that he would just leave. This is a reproduction of a banjo that was attributed to Joel Sweeney. It was made a couple years ago by a banjo maker up in New York. This is one of the many models that he makes. It has 5 strings. For a long time, Joel Sweeney was given credit for inventing the banjo, which we know was already here before Joel was born. And then later on, he was given credit for adding the chanter, or the chanterelle, the short drone 5th string. And there are early instruments that predate him that show this short string on it. So as you can imagine, when he came back to Appomattox County in the 1840s, he was quite the local hero, you know, the local boy done good. The Lynchburg newspapers wrote about his return and, you know, told people if they had somehow missed hearing Joel Sweeney before, that they definitely had to hear him now. But of course, you know, like a lot of traveling musicians, it had just gotten into his system, and he didn't stay here very long before he lit out on the road again and began performing. By the 1850s, when the census was taken that summer, the census taker came around and found Joel and his brothers staying at their sister's home here in Appomattox County, and they gave their occupation as musicians. They continued to play, but Joel apparently was ill, and by the late 1850s, his illness had started to impact his performance. Like all rock stars, as meteoric as his rise to fame was, he was surpassed by people that were quick to learn from him and to go on to take the banjo to the next level. He sort of became the rock star of the 1840s. A lot of people compare him to Elvis Presley because there's this young white musician that takes an instrument from African American culture and introduces it to white audiences.
It was the early 1900s. Slavery was a thing of the past, but there was still plenty to sing the blues about. One of the pioneers of East Coast or Piedmont blues was Luke Jordan, who lived here in Lynchburg. He was a very popular street musician back in the 1920s and recorded several tunes for the Victor label. His sweet tenor voice, combined with his ragtime-like guitar strumming, made him a well-regarded musician in his day.
I'm not gonna push you, put him mama while the weather's cool. Around your back door says, honey, I'm gonna creep. As long as you make those sort of half of
So Luke Jordan's style today is called Piedmont blues, and it was an East Coast style, so you would hear it all the way from Maryland through Virginia, North Carolina. It's a very syncopated style that was played with the thumb doing the rhythm on the bass strings and then playing the melody lines on the upper strings. It's very different than what we might think of as blues today.
Just around the
One of the great stories about Luke Jordan that really gives you a sense of what he was all about happened while we were here during the dedication of this historical marker that you see behind me. And a gentleman was at the dedication, and he mentioned that he knew Luke Jordan and was familiar with his performing on the streets here in Lynchburg, and that people would hire him to essentially be a human jukebox in their car while a couple went on a date. And this gives you a indication of his versatility, but also that he was a well-known and very popular singer in the town.
Then at some point, I suppose a talent scout for the Victor label passed through Lynchburg, or somehow managed to hear of Luke Jordan and engaged him to come down to Charlotte, North Carolina, when the Victor Company was on a field trip recording their mostly country artists, and Luke Jordan made his first records. And the story, as I understand it, is that he recorded one side, but he didn't have another song for the flip side of the record. And they said, well, we need at least 2 sides from you. Certainly you have another song you can play. And that in about 15 minutes, he sort of stepped into the restroom or whatever and thought about this and scratched out the words for Pick Poor Robin Clean and came in and recorded that. And of course, that's the side for which he's probably become best known now, is Pick Poor Robin Clean.
I'm kind of ashamed to tell you that I didn't really know about him until about 20 years ago, after all these years of living here. But to me, he kind of is a predecessor a little bit of like somebody like Blind Boy Fuller. It kind of reminds me of that style, but maybe just a few years earlier before it kind of went maybe a slightly more modern way. But I noticed in a lot of his songs he will throw in what I call calypso rhythms. I'm just a child. I'm just a child. I'll always be one as far as that goes. Those guys, I mean, they were doing it almost 100 years ago, and I'm still trying to figure it out. And they just did it like they were breathing, and I'm still fighting it every second. But I didn't know of anybody around here before him that played anything like that. And I was studying all this stuff from, of course, Mississippi and Arkansas and North Carolina and Alabama, and didn't really realize there was somebody here, and it took a while to settle in, but now I really appreciate it much more than I ever did before, actually.
Oh, the church bells are ringing, the secretary's singing, the preacher's preaching, can't you hear the sister shouting? Children's in the pulpit, Mama trying to learn my song. Now that low down dirty deacon done stole my gal and gone. Says, oh, my brother had 'em, my sister had 'em, my auntie had 'em, my mother died with 'em. Woke up this morning, the family had to wear it blue. And the people over in the corner, poor grandmammy had 'em too. I did more for you, woman, way last winter, late in the fall, man, when I scuffled through the summer. I did more for you, woman, than the good Lord ain't ever done. Came downtown and bought you good hand, and Lord hadn't give you none.
One thing we don't really know, which is kind of interesting to me, is how was it that anyone knew about him? So that he ended up in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1927 and in 29 to record for Victor, major label at the time. And it's one of those things where it's really difficult to know how that happened. It could be the local store owner here in town knew about him, as everybody would have, and recommended him to the company. That happened pretty frequently. If I remember correctly, there are only 4 known records, 2 sides on each record, so 8 total released sides. There may have been some recordings that were never released and simply don't exist anymore. And in fact, there's one of the recordings there's only 1 known copy of, and it was only recently discovered. So unfortunately, we don't have the full breadth of his repertoire, but we have a nice sampling of it at any rate.
As a kid, my grandfather used to tell me about Luke Jordan. I would hear this name, Luke Jordan, and always with an air of reverence about it. And it didn't register when I was a kid, partly because I'd never seen a picture of him, I'd never heard any of his music, so I didn't know what my grandfather was talking about. But he would tell me stories of going down by the James River, or coming down around Craddock Terry, this would be in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and seeing Luke Jordan on the corner singing for nickels. And on several occasions, he would go with him down to the banks of the James River, and they would sit there and play guitar together because my grandfather played guitar. And he would tell me about teaching Luke Jordan block chords on his guitar, and Luke Jordan would teach him a few things. And my first clue that there was something special about Luke Jordan was when my grandfather told me that he wanted me to hear his records, but he knew only one person who had any of them, and this person wasn't going to play them for fear of damaging them. And I thought, well, how hard can that be? And it was only later that I realized that Luke Jordan's records now command huge prices, astronomical prices among blues 78 collectors. I mean, you're looking at $1,000, $5,000, even possibly $10,000 for some of the rarer Luke Jordan items.
First, I think you get a sense of some of the issues in the African American community through his music. Talks about relationships. That's what blues is all about. It's about men and women. And some of the songs are, I'll say, pretty humorous in terms of talking about women and their relationship to men. I'll leave it at that. You get some social commentary, so cocaine blues, and cocaine was legal for quite a long period of time, and we think drug use and those problems of poor people are new, but they're not. So it's a social commentary, as blues often is. I guess you had to be a born performer because, you know, you'd have to really enjoy playing for people and interacting with people. Otherwise, you would never want to do this. And, you know, again, part of it is the reality that, you know, there were very limited options for African American men in terms of what they could even work at in the Jim Crow era that he lived in. You know, this is the time of segregation. So, a job where you were basically self-employed and, you know, set your own time schedule, that was a kind of freedom that most black men didn't have at that time. So there's a certain freedom to it.
You better stop your nab-head woman for meeting my meat, drinking my wine, spend all my money. You better stop your gal, button from 6 feet under my chin. You're gonna run on some of these mornings, partner, swear you can't get in.
In our next installment of Music Matters, we'll learn how Lynchburg played a role in the rockabilly craze and listen to the sweet sounds of Syl Turner. Until then, sit back, listen to some of your favorite music, and remember, music matters.
I was walking down 5th Street, turning out Main, looking for the man, sell cocaine. Won't you be kind to your kitchen? I'm in your dining room. Scrub out your pantry now. Won't you be kind? Keep your backyard clean. There's old Aunt Donna, a good old soul. She makes a living by cooking light roll. Won't you be kind to your kitchen? I'm in your dining room. Scrub out your pantry now. Won't you be kind and keep your backyard clean?